Hello and welcome to our OECA video tutorial series. This episode, we will explain how to master the networking and the firewalls in your operating system. I'm Irene and I'm excited to guide you through today's course. Whether you are a beginner just getting started or an experienced user looking to refine your skills, this tutorial has something for everyone. Firewalls have become essential in today's digital landscape. This tutorial covers everything from the basics of network management to advanced firewall configurations on openEuler. So here's what's on the agenda today. First, using Network Manager CLI to configure the network. Second, using ifconfig to configure the network. Third, network IP commands. Fourth, hostname, and the fifth, firewall basics. So let's dive in and get started. On openEuler, we use Network Manager to manage the networking. Network Manager utilizes the command line interface, CLI, for configuration, and it's also compatible with the ifconfig configuration file. Let's see how to use CLI for network configuration. CLI is a command line tool that configures how Network Manager manages network connections. The basic format for CLI commands is as follows. Object refers to all components on or connected to the system. Possible objects include general, networking, radio, connection, or device. Common options are T, test for scripts, P, pretty for users, H, help for help. For more information about CLI commands, you can run the help command. Here are some typical commands. Remember to start and stop network ports using CLI. You need to run these commands as the root user. Let's continue our exploration of network management on openEuler by diving into device management commands. To connect Network Manager to a network device, search for and activate the appropriate connection configuration, and then run the connect command. If there are no existing connections, Network Manager will create and activate a new profile with default settings. To disconnect a device and prevent it from being automatically activated, use the disconnect command. Now let's look at these network connection commands. To connect Network Manager with the network device, search for and activate the appropriate connection configuration, and then run the connect command. To query all available network connections, run the show command. The output will look something like this. Here, name denotes the connection ID or name. When the network connection is added, a configuration file is generated and associated with the device. To query device status, run the following command. The output displays the status of each device like this. These commands let you to connect, disconnect, and check the status of your network interfaces easily, so making it an essential part of system management. Now let's look at how to set dynamic IP connections using CLI. To allocate networks over DHCP, you can use dynamic IP configuration to add a network configuration file. The following is the command format. For example, run the following command to create a dynamic connection configuration file named nettest. After running this command, you will see a confirmation message. Network Manager sets connection.autoconnect to yes and saves the settings to the ifconfig net test file. In this file, onBoot is set to yes. To activate the network connection, run the following command as the root user. Then you will receive a confirmation, like this. You can run this command to check the statuses of these devices and their connections. Then the output will display the status of each device like this. These steps explain how to configure dynamic IP connections on your openEuler system. This is particularly useful for environments where DHCP is used to dynamically allocate IP addresses. Next, onto static IP connections. The following command format is needed for adding a static IPv4 network connection. To create a static connection configuration file named netStatic, run this command. Network Manager sets IPv4.method to menu, connection.autoconnect to yes, and writes the settings to the ifconfig.myoffice file, where boot proto is set to none and onBoot is set to yes. To set two IPv4 DNS server addresses, run the following command as the root user. To activate the new network connection, run this command. Then you will see a confirmation message like this. To check the statuses of these devices and their connections, use the following command. The output will display the status of each device. To view details of a configured connection, use the Pretty option to add titles and segments to the output. The output will display detailed information like this one. We can also configure a static root for the network connection with the following command. You can also use the nmcli editor to configure a static root. Start the editor with the command like this. This will let you enter the nmcli editor interface. When saving the connection, you will see the following message. These steps explain how to configure and manage static IP connections and routes on openEuler to help you better control and customize your network. In the next part of this tutorial, we will learn how to configure a static network using the ifconfig file. To explain how to configure a static network using the ifconfig file, we'll use the NP4S0 network interface as an example. The following is a step-by-step instruction as the root user. First, we modify the parameter settings in the ifconfig NP4S0 file located in the network scripts directory. Here is an example of how the file should look. Let's break down these parameters. Type specifies the interface type. Device name, which in this case is NP4S0. Boot proto, set to none or static IP configuration. onBoot, set to yes to activate the interface at boot time. IP address, static IP address assigned to the device. Prefix, number or bits of the network address. Default root indicates the default root. IPv6 init, IPv6 autoconfig, or others means IPv6 settings. Name, the name of the connection. UUID means unique identifier for the connection. Configurations from the ifconfig file does not take effect immediately and require you to restart the network service. You can do this by running the following command as the root user. Remember, the configuration file can contain complete parameters, but you can configure parameters with the minimum required settings. The NIC configuration file must be named in a format ifconfig ifname, and prefix can also be set using netmask. Do not configure IP addresses in the same network segment for different NICs. Here's a quick reference table for the main ifconfig parameters. These parameters are case insensitive and can be enclosed in quotation marks. And that's how you configure a static network using the ifconfig file, which gives you direct control over your network settings and can be particularly useful in server environments. Here, we explore how to configure a dynamic network and set a default gateway on openEuler using the ifconfig file. To configure a dynamic network for the M1 interface, you need to generate an ifconfig M1 file in the network scripts directory. Here is an example file. If you want to ignore the routes sent by the DHCP server and prevent the network service from using the updated configuration file sent by the DNS server, add the following content to the ifconfig file. To configure an interface to use specific DNS servers, set peer DNS to no and add the following content to the ifconfig file. Here, IP address is the IP address of a specified DNS server, which is used by the network service to update the resolve configuration file. Now, let's talk about the default gateway. When determining the default gateway, the system first parses the network file and then the ifconfig file. The last read value of gateway is used as the default route in the routing table. When using Network Manager to manage hosts in a dynamic network environment, IP addresses are allocated over DHCP. To configure the default gateway in the network file, use the following syntax. Here's an example of the default gateway on M1 port. The network file provides global default routing, but with a low priority. It is advised to set the global default route in the ifconfig file. Remember, only one default route takes effect. If multiple default routes are configured, the route with the smaller number of rows takes effect. This method shows a flexible, automated way to configure a dynamic network and a default gateway using the ifconfig file, something very useful in dynamic environments. In this segment, we'll use IP commands to configure the network on openEuler. First, let's configure an IP address for an interface. The basic command format is like this. To add an IP address to the NP3S0 interface, run the following command as the root user. To verify the configuration, use the show command. You will see an output similar to this. Remember, network configurations made using IP commands take effect immediately but are not retained after a system restart. Now let's configure multiple IP addresses for the same interface using the following commands. And verify the configuration with the IP address command. The output should reflect the additional IP addresses. Next, let's configure a static route. Use the IP route add command to add a static root to the root table. Other options include delete, change, append, and replace. The command format is like this. To display the current IP routing table, run the iproot command. An example output might look like this. To add a static root to a host address, use this command. Where 192.168.2.1 is the IP address, 10.0.0.1 is the next hop, and interface name is the exit interface of the next hop. You can add a static root to a network like this. In this command, 192.168.2.0 to 24 represents the IP address range of the target network. That covers how to use IP commands to configure the network on openEuler, a method that provides granular control for networks and in advanced network setups. In this segment, we are going to learn how to configure a host name on openEuler. There are three types of host names you can configure. First, static host name is set by the user and saved in the hostname file. Second, transient host name is a dynamic name maintained by the kernel and initialized to the static host name by default. It can be changed using DHCP or the mDNS at runtime. Third, pretty host name is a free-form host name that can include special characters and white space characters. Static and transient host names can only contain letters, numbers, hyphens, underscores, and dots. And host names cannot start or end with a dot, contain 2 consecutive dots, or exceed 64 characters. Now let's see how to use host name control to configure host names. To display all the current host names, use the status command. If no option is specified, the status option is used by default. To set all the host names on the system, run this command as the root user. To set a specific host name, run this following command. Here, option can be one or multiple objects like pretty, static, and transient. If you use pretty with the static or transient, the static and transient host names will be simplified forms of the pretty host name. For instance, spaces will be replaced by hyphens, and special characters will be removed. To set a pretty host name, remember to use quotation marks if it contains spaces or a single quotation mark. Here is an example. To clear a specific host name and restore it to the default format, run the following command, where the double quote marks represent a blank string. To remotely change the host name, use the H and host options. For example, in this command, host name is the remote host to be configured. Username is optional, and new host name is the new host name. Hostname control connects to the remote system through SSH. You can also use nmcli to configure host names. To query the static host name, run the general hostname command. To set the static host name to host server, run this following command. Restart the systemd hostnamed service. To ensure hostname control detects the change of the static host name, run the following command. Well, that's how you configure host names on openEuler using hostname control and nmcli. Next, we will dive into firewall basics. The firewall in openEuler protects the system by dividing it into different zones and acts as the front end of the IP tables packet filtering system provided by the kernel. Zone means the firewall daemon manages groups of rules through an entity called a zone. A zone is essentially a group of rules that allows or rejects network traffic based on the network's trust level. Zones are predefined in the firewall, ranging from the least trusted to the most trusted. Let's go through the predefined zones. Drop, the lowest trust level. All incoming packets are discarded without any response, and only outgoing connections are allowed. Block, incoming requests are rejected with a message prompt. Public, for public and untrusted networks. Other computers are not trusted, but selected incoming connections are allowed. External, applicable when the firewall serves as a gateway. It is configured as NAT to keep your internal network private but accessible. DMZ, for computers in a DMZ network. Connections are isolated from the rest of the network, and only certain incoming connections are allowed. Work, for work networks, where most computers are trusted. Home, for home networks, where most computers are trusted. Internal, for internal side of the gateway, where computers are trustworthy and additional services are available. Trusted, all computers in the network are trusted. This is the most open option and should be used with caution. Now let's learn how to manage the firewall. If the firewall is not started after installation, you need to enable the firewall service to start on system startup. Run the following command. To start the firewall and view its status, run this following command. You can also check if the firewall is running with this command. In terms of the firewall zones, the default firewall zone is public. To check the default zone, run this following command. To check the interfaces bound to each zone, use this one. To change the zone bound to an interface, for example, changing NS3 from public to external, run the following command. If you want to modify default zone directly, use this following command. Well, that's it for the basics of firewalls on openEuler. We covered firewall zones and how to start and check the firewall status. And that's a wrap. Today, we learned the essentials of network management and how to configure firewalls on openEuler. We hope you found this tutorial helpful and that you feel more confident in managing your network and securing it with a firewall. Remember, a well-managed network and a strong firewall are key to protecting your data and ensuring uptime. If you have any questions or need further assistance, don't hesitate to leave a comment below or reach out to our support team. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more tutorials. Until next time, take care.